So my talk is going to be about Xamarin, as it has been introduced. The title of my talk is From Native to Xamarin, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love Cross-Platform. So a little bit about my background. So, I've started writing iOS apps about a year ago. Before that I was at university. When I started I was using Objective-C and iOS, and when I was using Objective-C people had already sort of moved on to Swift at that point. So I was perhaps a little late in adopting the new language for the platform. Perhaps that wasn't the best choice. So of course it was only iOS at the start. I started out with a loyalty to a particular platform, which is something I think a lot of you will have experienced. You sort of have your set way of doing things, your set community. So I think many of us can relate to that experience. Also, I thought it's probably going to be too hard to get really good at both sets of APIs. There's hundreds of APIs in iOS and hundreds of APIs in Android. And I thought you can either get really good at iOS dev or you can get really good at Android dev. But you can't ever be very proficient at both of them. So obviously I thought there's hardly enough time to learn both of those. So finally, I think I've always wanted to write truly native apps, whatever that means. Whether that just means writing them the native way. Maybe it's because I thought this is the only proper way to write apps. Maybe because I was used to using the native tools and the native languages. I just instinctively thought they were better. So when I applied for my current job, when I'd be using Xamarin, I had a few reservations. So what was I worried about? So I think the biggest issue we face when we're looking at Xamarin is the Xamarin apps are not truly native. So I wasn't sure if this was true when I started my current job. I wasn't sure if this was a statement of fact. So can we build apps with Xamarin that look and feel the same as a user would expect on the native platforms? Are we sacrificing the control and the precision when using Xamarin that we would if we were using the native tools? In short, the answer to this is no. We're not sacrificing any precision. This is because Xamarin as a platform provides access to 100% of the iOS and 100% of the Android APIs. And this is kind of fundamental to what Xamarin is. This allows you to use every single class in every single native library in every single OS release. So we call these native APIs from our C# code, and we can do everything we would were we to be using the native tools. So 100% of the native APIs, in my opinion, means 100% native apps. We are using exactly the same APIs as we're using on each platform, so we know exactly what we're building. So now if we think about the output of Xamarin, we're going to produce a fully compiled binary on iOS or intermediate language for just-in-time compilation on Android. So of course this means that the output of Xamarin is exactly the same as it would be and what you expect if you're using the native tools. So now we'll look at some code written in Swift, and I'll show you the same code written in C# in Xamarin, and we'll see how they compare. So hopefully you'll see the similarities. So this sort of thing will be quite familiar to anyone used to building iOS apps or using Swift. This is sort of the most basic thing you can do with a few lines of code that actually means something. So you're going to have a view controller in Swift. We've also got a table view. We're setting its data source. We could give it some mock data to put in the cells just to be confident that the code's actually working and doing something. So I kind of want you to take a second and look at this code and see, sort of remember, because now I'll show you what Xamarin would look like. So were we to write the same code in C# and Xamarin, it would look something like this. So firstly you'll see how similar it looks and how pretty much indistinguishable it is from our Swift code. So there are some native differences, some naming differences. So instead of in iOS we would have a method called self or row at index path. In Xamarin we have a method called getCell. But apart from that, you can see we're calling the exact same classes and methods as we would be were we to be using native. We have our UI table view, our table view cells, our NS index path. So these are exactly the same classes that we're calling the native, and pretty much line for line we're doing exactly the same things. So at this point we know exactly which native classes we're dealing with, we know exactly how it's going to perform on each platform. And this is similar to the point I've made earlier. 100% access to the native APIs means we're writing 100% of a native application. So I like to think of this one-to-one mapping between the Xamarin APIs and the native APIs as the exact opposite of a black box solution, because we always know what we're dealing with. So I've got a little bit more example code. So this is just to demonstrate that you can get points in pub quizzes if you're using Xamarin. And yet I was still worried. So what was I still worried about? So we're not going to be using the native tools. We're not going to be using Xcode and Android Studio. So what are we going to be using? So what would you encounter if you were to build an application in Xamarin? So first and foremost, you're going to be working with Visual Studio the majority of the time. The question is, how good is Visual Studio as an IDE? So the answer to this is just like Xcode, just like Android Studio. When it works, it's fantastic. And when it doesn't, it's the worst piece of software ever created. So what would the structure of your cross-platform app look like within Visual Studio? So this is a closer look at your cross-platform app and the structure of it, and I'll sort of go through each part and tell you what each project corresponds to. So typically you'll really see at least 3 projects in every Xamarin solution. You'll see your cross-platform library, a Droid, and an iOS project. So in this shared project, this is basically, in here it's called basic app. It doesn't have a prefix of .ios or .droid. And in this shared project, we will put all of our business logic, you could say, all of your code that's shared between platforms. And to build this, we're going to be interacting with .NET, predominantly .NET classes. So that's going to be your lists and your collections and things. And we don't put any platform-specific code in this core project because it's referenced by the Droid and the iOS project. Secondly, there's going to be a platform-specific project for each platform. So in each of these projects, you'll see the sort of files that you would expect if you were used to doing native development on each of these platforms. So this means in Droid, you're going to see your manifest files, you're going to see activities. There'll be .cs rather than .java, but they're exactly the same files. And your resources folders will be there exactly the same. In iOS, that means you're going to see view controllers, app delegates, info.plists. So in Visual Studio, you're really looking at exactly the same files as you would be if you were using the native tools. So sort of the second part of any app is going to be layout files. So typically in iOS, we're using nib files. In Android, we're using XML files. They're sort of very similar. So in Droid, we're going to edit these files exactly the same way. You just click on your .xml file, you open it up in Xamarin, and you'll see this is pretty much exactly how it would look were you to use Android Studio. You edit it, you can drag in widgets, do all that sort of stuff. And of course, the thing that's backing this file is your .axml, your Android XML, which is, of course, this file. It's important to make the point that this is indistinguishable from what it would be if you were developing it in Android. It's exactly the same file. You can build this file in Android and import it if you like, but it's exactly the same. There's no difference. So now looking at iOS, so you see I have Xcode open, and the reason being is that we're also dealing with nib files in our Xamarin projects, with storyboards or nib files. And often when we choose to develop apps in Xamarin, we're going to use Xcode's interface builder rather than the built-in Xamarin the Xamarin editor for these nib files. So you basically just right-click on your nib files, click Open in Xcode, and you just get the designer as you would be used, or the interface builder just like you would be used to. So what this means really is we're building identical UI files. The files that we build on Android are exactly Android and iOS are the UI files are exactly the same as they would be if we were to build them using the native tools. So you sort of know exactly what you're dealing with. So how do we access these widgets? Well, this is obviously quite similar, but of course, looking at some Droid code this time, this hardly needs to be explained. This is exactly the same. We say button, and then we say find view by ID, and then we're going to look in our resource file. We're going to find the button, the ID of the button, and that's how you access your button. That's how you would do it in Droid. And in iOS, you actually have something called an outlet, and you just access it in your view did load exactly the same. So we have these backing UI files, and then we have our code that we can access these elements. So the next thing we have is third-party libraries. So a common misconception is that you're sort of losing out in Xamarin because you can't access the same third-party libraries that you would be if you were using each of the platforms. So you can actually create bindings from C# to any library written in C, Objective-C, or Java. This is sort of a trivial example, but it might look something like this. You see, you have this export directive, and you have something like set I, X, I, Y, and I, Z. You have those colons. That would just be the method name in Objective-C, and then beneath it you'd have the method that your code would call from C#. Okay, so hopefully you're no longer worried, the question being, why Xamarin? So firstly, I believe that Xamarin is the happy middle ground. You can reuse your code, and you can develop a truly native experience on both platforms. So the second is code reuse, and why is this important? So depending on who you ask, you can probably write about 60% of your code in this shared library. So of course this speeds up development time and makes your code easier to test and makes your code more safe. So thirdly, which is sometimes overlooked, is platform parity. So when you develop an app using Xamarin, if you're a company that perhaps has an iOS team and an Android team, you might find that those apps are at very different levels in terms of the features they offer. But in Xamarin, you're going to have a lot of parity between your two platforms. This means that they'll both contain all of the same features and provide a unified experience. Often when you're building your iOS app, you'll sort of feel like your Android app is being built at the same time because you're adding the logic in the cross-platform code. So in conclusion, Xamarin is a completely native solution with access to 100% of the native APIs. We're editing exactly the same UI files that you would find on each platform, and we can access third-party libraries through the use of custom bindings. So, thanks.